Hello, Wasteland! Yes, and welcome to today's episode where we're looking at Dungeons and Dragons, Nolzur's marvellous miniatures, the primed, ready to paint straight out of the box. Deep cuts? I want to say these are deep cuts. I could be wrong, but they're by Wizkids anyway. You guys know what this is. This is the pre-based and ready to paint straight out of the packet Dungeons and Dragons miniatures. So I like to collect fantasy models. I've got a growing collection of sort of more generic fantasy that for the longest time I just sort of don't really use for anything because it's sort of a hodgepodge of dwarves and orcs and elves and humans and goodness knows what. And you know, I like the idea of one day playing some D&D properly with models, so may as well start collecting and painting them now. Doesn't hurt anyone. And these look like these could be quite a nice, quick and easy project because they're clear plastic, so I could just throw a wash on them, do the base and call it done. And that sounds easy, so let's see if it is. Now I'm changing these over to 25mm rounds, similar to what you get with 40k or any Games Workshop game, because I just prefer the depth. I prefer the weight to them compared to these D&D thin plastic bases that I don't really think much of them. And you can get these, you don't have to go for Games Workshop ones, you can get these anywhere. I get them off eBay for like 100 for £5. Like, don't pay out the nose for bases. I mean, these require a little bit of prep. You have to sand the bottom a little bit because there'll be like a little casting nub from when they were made. Now let's talk about mould lines on these D&D models. Now the tricky thing with Wizkids is everything they design now is done on a computer first. And unless you see it in person, you won't really know what the mould lines are like. Now, on the bases, it's not too bad because I can just throw on some, you know, solid texture material and cover over it. But on the model itself, oh boy, you've got to keep an eye out. Now, I'm just taking the paint off the bottoms so that when I put this plastic glue on, it will adhere to the base nicely. These glued on a treat, by the way, using plastic glue, so don't worry. If you're like, oh, I don't know if it will work or not, no, it will work fine. You won't have a single issue. You can use super glue if you want, but it's not necessary. You don't have to. But yeah, give it a couple of minutes to dry. But yeah, with the mould lines, you do get some big ones, and as you can see here from this close up, it's not terrible. While I'm painting, I can, you know, trying to avoid it so it's not noticeable, but because it's clear plastic, it's not like I can just scrape a knife over it and remove it, because you'll see it regardless of what I do. Whereas you see some of the Wizkids models out there and oh my goodness, it's all mould lines. So here we are using some much loved Sterland mud to do the base texturing. This is just quick and easy. One of the tricky things when working with clear plastic models is that you don't want to get any paint or anything on the clear plastic itself because it's a sod to get off. So I would recommend using something like this rather than doing the basing yourself, like say with PVA and sand. The only downside is it does take a little bit of time to dry, but that's alright, we can be doing other stuff in the meantime. Like, for example, deciding on our paint scheme. Now, these being ethereal creatures, ghosts and spirits, you could paint them pretty much however you like. So the Banshee, I'm going to go with a bit of a purpley scheme using Druchii Violet as a base, but then with the ghost, I'm going to be using this blue wash from, well, Game Colour, I guess they're called, and this is something I bought years ago, so I'm not even particularly sure if it's any good still, but hey, it still sounds juicy in the bottle, so we will find out. And then it's just a matter of deciding, well, what are the accent colours going to be when you're using these. So you've got the main wash that's going to tint the actual plastic, but what are you going to use for the shadows? What are you going to use for the highlights? Nuln Oil is of course a fan favourite. Mix a bit of that in with the Druchii Violet and should create some nice dark shadows. And for the ghost, I figure if I'm doing blue, why not crack out the old GW Citadel blue ink that they used to do back in the day? Yeah, I bet you guys haven't seen one of those in a while. Or maybe you have. Yeah, it's one of those strange, certain paints manage to survive the test of time, and the ink certainly were one of them. Bases, absolute standard practice. Mornfoam brown, Shabty bone, and Abaddon black for the rim. You know, hey, it's tried and true. What can I say? So let's jump straight into this. Now, again, texture paint takes a little bit of time to dry. If you need to test it, just dab it with your finger, see if any comes off. Don't worry too much. You know, if it's still wet, just leave it to dry a bit longer. That's fine. In the meantime, we can be looking at this wash, and oh boy, yeah, it's been a while. So this stuff, very, very heavily pigmented. Certainly a lot heavier than your standard Games Workshop wash. So clearly this is going to need some water mixed in with it. And I know some of you like your contrast mediums and flow aid or whatever. Just use some water. It works fine. And shout out to jam jar lids as painting palettes. Here, by actually mixing it on top of all these other dried colours, I can see what it would look like on those other dried colours. Now, this is my first time painting clear plastic models, so I am quite sort of tentative with this. You know, I'm not just jumping arms into it and going, yeah, just splash it all over the model, you know, big disaster. Do a little bit. See how it works, see how it goes on the model, see how it looks as you look through the model, because it's see-through. You're seeing both the front and the back and the sides. You're seeing all light enter and exit the model at different angles. For example, you see her hand that's closed in a sort of a fist, her right arm. There is a peg that connects that arm to her body. Now, if I was a bit more careful with that wash, you wouldn't see that peg. It would be hidden. It wouldn't have got, the wash wouldn't have gotten into the cracks and then surrounded it. But with the Banshee, you can see now that I sort of know, I can just sort of lather it on, especially with the Drucci Violet because it's so thin. Yeah, just get that on there. And then if we compare that to when it's dry, it's so light by comparison, but it has clearly tinted the model, which is good. Something that I should mention with these is when these are finished, I'm not going to be giving them a varnish spray at all. Not gloss varnish, not matte, nothing. Because at the end of the day, you do that to a clear plastic model, it's just going to fog it. You're not going to see the clear plastic effect anymore. Now, this blue ink by Games Workshop back in the day, oh my goodness, is this heavily pigmented. I think it's the hardest, most heaviest pigmented thing I've ever seen in my life. Now, I'm mixing water with this, but you can still see how dark that is, which means it's perfect for our use here, because we're going to use this to go around all those little crooks and crevices and little gaps and get it in all the corners to create the really nice dark definition between body parts, between the hand holding the severed head, between the hair and the body, between the arm and the elbow. You know, you can separate out all these areas that ordinarily might be a bit hard to see. Because I've seen quite a few of these online now where people will buy like the Ghost and the Banshee, or they'll buy one of the other clear see-through D&D models and they'll throw a wash on it and call it a day, and it's like, yeah, it works, but you're missing out on a lot of detail. You're missing out on a lot of definition. So you can see I've mixed about a 50-50 split of Drucci Violet and Null Oil to create a nice darker tone. Now this one's not nearly as heavily pigmented as the blue ink was, so I do need to sort of go over areas. The mouth especially is quite difficult on the Banshee because it's not very deep, so seeing the teeth, trying to see the detail there, it's really quite hard. But here you go, it gives you an idea of kind of what I'm working towards. And don't get me wrong, the steps after this point, I mean, other than painting the base, you know, it's pretty much done for the actual spirit. If you wanted to leave it there, I think that'd be perfectly fine. Bit of a tip here when it comes to painting the bases. In the areas leading up to the clear plastic, you can use a big brush. That's fine, because the bristles aren't going to go anywhere near the model. The closer you get to the model, use a finer brush. Okay, so what I'm going to mix up here is, this is a clear plastic model, but I'm going to mix a lighter tone just to do some edge highlighting. So this isn't going to be the entire model. It's not going to be every single edge, every single highlight. No. Just a little bit, just to get some definition on like the nose, the cheekbones, the fingers on the hands, things like that. And you don't have to like use separate paints. I'm just going to use bleach bone mixed in with a bit of that blue wash, the original base tone, just to, get it closer to a blue rather than a beige. And here you go, you can see me getting some of that detail on. Now, again, first time doing this, so I'm being very timid, and I do apologise for the blurriness. So I try to zoom in, but it doesn't always work. But the idea is we're not, dry brushing it. We're not trying to cover the whole thing. We're just trying to get a feel for the raised areas. It's still ephemeral. It's still a ghost-like creature. It's just there are certain bits where the moonlight catches it and you can see it a bit clearer. Now over this I'm going to go over with a bit of the bleach bone, a bit of the beige, just to highlight certain areas. And again, it's just, use a fine brush. I'm using a starter brush. It's not like some amazing triple X, super laser accurate brush. It's just a regular brush with a good fine point on it. And you know what? Those Games Workshop starter brushes, they get a lot of stick from people for not being very good. Well, you know what? I think they're great. I think they're absolutely fine. If you don't want them, send them to me. I don't mind. There you go. All right, let's do some dry brushing on this base. So I'm going to use this large base brush. Going to mix up some of that shabty bone, dry it off on the bit of newspaper there, because you don't need a lot on the brush. We're not trying to heavily overload it. We just want to get just enough so that as we start to dry brush and go across the whole model, there you go, get that nice raised details. And again, we're controlling it so that as we get closer to the actual clear see-through plastic, we're not brushing onto it too much. I mean, it's kind of unavoidable, but just a little bit. And then you know what? A bit of black around the rims. And you know what, boys and girls? You did it. If you followed along, you too will have painted a headless ghost and a ferocious banshee for your, well, I suppose games of Dungeons and Dragons, or, I mean, I like the idea of using these in Frostgrave, to be fair, because they're quite nice, generic kind of spooky monsters, aren't they? Ghosts and banshees. Here we've got some of my nice Warhammer Fantasy dwarves that I've painted up for Frostgrave and things like that. They've come across a ghost, but little did they know behind them was a banshee. Yes, I really need to do some set dressing. I think that's going to be the next one, doing some terrain, doing some backdrops just for a bit more atmosphere, because at the moment it's a bit white void of nothingness. Anyway, boys and girls, I hope you've enjoyed this video today. It's been pretty quick, pretty simple. I mean, take that gravestone, for example. All I did was slap some Nuln oil on there. Done. I didn't even bother highlighting it. There's no need. But it works. And you put some grassy tufts on the basin before you know it. They're good to go. But if you've followed along, I hope you've enjoyed this video today. These have been remarkably easy to paint. Easily get them done in a couple of hours. I mean, there's some drying times with the base material, but this isn't like an all-weekend project. You can knock out quite a few of these. So, you never know. You might see more of these Dungeons & Dragons miniature videos on the channel. But thank you all for watching Wasteland, and I will see you all in the next episode. Bye-bye.